to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here, and on today's episode, we're going to do a quick dive on the Baylor Bears. Now, we've been covering the Big 12 for a little bit now, and when I was kind of sitting down thinking about what other teams we can kind of discuss on the show here, Baylor came to mind because when I sat down and thought about it, there really aren't too many head coaches that are really kind of on the quote-unquote, sort of hot seat. And it made me think to myself, I think Baylor would be an interesting team to dive into, particularly because, Dave Aranda now, he's going to his fifth year, 23-25 overall. And, over the past 15 years, the Baylor has so many ups and downs, and, considering, where they're at in the country too, it's obviously one of the most challenging places in the entire country to recruit with all the other schools in Texas. And then you have New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, all these other states and schools that you have to worry about. So that in particular came to mind. And when I sat down and thought about it, there were a couple things that sort of came to mind. Obviously, there's a bunch of changes that we're going to see this year with Baylor. First of all, the Bears did hire Jake Spotteval, who used to be the Texas State head coach. He's going to be running the offense now. And compared to, kind of what we saw at Texas State now, they have J.G. Kenny, who, kind of does the air raid offense, and he was with Incarnate Word before. And, that offense is a lot of fun to watch. So I'm curious to see how that's sort of going to fit with kind of the playmakers they have now. And, they do bring back their top 5 receivers, so, there is some continuity there in terms of the actual program itself, although there, definitely a lot that's going to have to sort of happen in order to really get there. Obviously, it hurts losing Blake Shippen, who, was their starter for about 2 years, but he went over to Mississippi State over with Jeff Levy over there, and I'm sure he'll be great. But as it stands right now, Baylor, it seems like the starter is going to be Daquan Finn, who is the 5th-year senior, transferred from Toledo. Who, by the way, I did watch a little bit of Daquan Finn, not necessarily throughout the year, but I particularly watched him in the MAC championship game against Miami, Ohio. And let me tell you, this kid is a lot of fun to watch. He's athletic, he's elusive, he's a leader, and he's one of those guys that you watch and he can just make every sort of throw in the field. He's versatile. He can make defenders miss. And, right now it kind of seems like to me that he will probably end up being the starter. And, also too, you do have Sawyer Robinson in the mix, who's pretty much been Blake's backup for the past couple years now. And trust me, he has every talent in the world to be able to get there and be able to start. But I think ultimately it's probably going to end up being Finn's job to lose. So we'll see what happens there. But even, when Baylor had a sort of, I guess more of a practice rather than a spring game, but you can definitely tell Finn definitely had some connections between, a lot of the receivers that he was throwing to versus right now. And I'm definitely excited too, because it's definitely going to be more of an air raid offense, kind of like what I alluded to with, the J.G. Kenny offenses and the Spotteval offenses and all that sort of good stuff too. And in terms of the defensive side of the ball, to me, this is really the year where we're going to see Dave's Aranda's footprint all over the defense. As you know, before last season they ended up 3-9, and he was kind of taking more of a sort of step back when it comes to the defense, relying on his coordinators, kind of letting them choose the plays. And then it got to a point where they were pretty much one of the worst defenses in all of the Big 12, giving up approximately 33.3 points a game, which was definitely the worst in the Big 12. Coupled that with 3-9, and I think what's going to be a little fascinating about watching, Ornata call this defense is he hasn't called the defense at all while in his past 4 seasons at Baylor. The last time he's called defense was back in 2019 when the Tigers won the national title. So I definitely think it's a necessary step, perhaps just temporarily, just for Ornata to kind of put his stamp on the defense, to get it going in the right direction. And this, quite frankly, really is a make or break year. And in order for to for that to happen, he's gonna have to take a more hands sort of role. And I think that's why it's essential that he brought in an experienced mind such as Jake Spadavall, who can run the offense, where he can spend a lot more time, focusing on the other side of the ball too. And despite the, giving up all these points, there is some talent on this team. The first guy I think of is Caden Jakins, who ended up being an All-American as a freshman at Baylor. I think, going into his sophomore year, he's definitely going to be one of the most important pieces in terms of getting this program back together. They have Kean Thomas, who's a transfer, who is now with the program, so that should be interesting. And as a defense who's ranked 115th nationally in the country, they're definitely going to have to make some strides on the defensive side of the ball. And even just briefly, just kind of looking at their schedule here, they're going through the ringer. They're playing some of the toughest teams in all of the Big 12. They start off at Arlington State, then they have to travel to Utah. They're traveling to Colorado. They're traveling to Iowa State, Texas Tech, and West Virginia. And they also have TCU on the schedule too. So ultimately, this season's really going to test Ornata's resolve in terms of a coach. He's going to have to put that stamp on the defense. Otherwise, he will likely not have another year. And it's going to be fascinating to see, does Baylor go with, proven DeQuan Finn, who's had some great seasons at Toledo. They were 11-3 last year. Came up a little bit short in the MAC championship, but the guy can obviously ball. Or do you go with Sawyer Robinson, who's been sitting behind Blake Shippen for a bunch of seasons now, understands the program, understands the amount of pressure that's under Ornata, who's quite frankly been loyal to the program. So in terms of all that, that's going to be definitely one of the biggest challenges. Granted, they do play Houston too. They do have BYU. They have Iowa State. So in terms of, where we sort of need to see, I think the biggest thing in terms of not so much a win and loss, I think obviously you have to be better than 3-9. But I think to me what's really going to come down to is what we see on the defensive side of the ball. Giving up 33 points a game is just not acceptable in the Big 12, especially when, it's definitely my opinion that the Big 12 is going to be the closest conference in terms of it's going to be the conference that it's going to come down to the final week of the year. And although I don't think Baylor's necessarily in the running for that, I do think they are going to be a program to watch with Ornata being on the hot seat, with DeQuan Finn coming in, with Jake Spadavall, and then you have some of those other players on defense who are returning, and we're definitely going to see a bunch of changes coming up.